Well, John, in his introduction, spoke about my alleged fame. I'm not sure about my alleged fame, but what I'm going to talk about this evening is my absolute, truthful infamy, because my past was certainly an infamous one. In fact, by the time that you've heard this talk, you'll realise you've been spending the evening in very disreputable company. So I hope that doesn't faze you too much. Can I ask a question here? Because I'm going to talk, by the way, if you didn't know, I presume you do know, that I'm going to be talking on my own conversion, based upon my book, Race with the Devil, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love, which as a US citizen these days, I became a US citizen a few years ago, it now means it's compulsory to make sure that you break up every talk with at least 2 or 3 commercial breaks. That was the first one. The book's for sale downstairs. Please buy a copy. But how many people here are converts to the faith, as opposed to cradle Catholics? Only 2. That's amazing. That's the lowest proportion ever. Well, I'm absolutely delighted we have such a wonderful congregation of cradle Catholics here. That's great. But I was going to ask now, but as only 2 people that I can actually address the question to, how many of you were asked to write a paper as part of your RCIA process, to which I know the answer is probably neither of you. None of you would be normal, but neither of you. Because it's very unusual, of course, as part of the conversion process to be asked to write a paper. But the priest who was instructing me in the Catholic faith asked me to write a paper on why I want to become a Catholic. And the reason he asked me for that, because that's not usual even in England, was because he knew that I'd been a writer in my previous life, as it were, and it just seemed appropriate to him that if a writer is what I am, then clearly I'm going to be able to articulate why I want to become a Catholic with the written word. Now, most of you are cradle Catholics, but many of you have been students. So most of you, I'm sure, at some stage or other have had to write papers. And you will know that the worst thing about writing a paper is getting started. It's the procrastination, and then eventually you have this blank piece of paper, at least in my day, you have a blank computer screen. You've got this blank page with nothing on it. How do you start? So I found myself in that position. And then, by the grace of God, some words enter my head, and they're words of a very famous hymn which we all know, which you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to sing to you, but I will recite the opening lines. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. And those words came to my head. They seemed to just insist themselves upon me, and I began the paper with those 4 lines from that famous hymn. And of course it was very, very appropriate for me because I'm coming from a white supremacist, racist, very antagonistic towards people other than myself and my race and my people, that hymn was of course written by John Newton, who before his conversion to Christianity was a slave trader. So it's a lot of symbolic resonance, but it came to me as a gift. I didn't think all that through and say, what would be an appropriate hymn? But the hymn came, and then I thought, wow, that's appropriate. So what I hope to show in the next sort of 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes, is that amazing grace that saved a wretch like me. Well, I was raised in a secular culture. My family, my parents never went to church. The only time we ever went to church was for weddings. My parents also went to funerals, but it wasn't thought appropriate for children to go to funerals. So the only time I ever saw the inside of a church was at the occasional wedding. There was no prayer life whatsoever. We never prayed. So really that God was irrelevant. It wasn't that my parents didn't believe. They weren't certainly were not atheists. In fact, if you pinned them down in the corner and asked them directly, they would say they were Christians. But they didn't think they needed to do anything about it, including actually pray and having a living relationship with Christ. So I was raised basically a de facto agnostic. God was not important. He was not a part of our lives. I didn't care. And I had an extremely bad education. And one of my passions, I speak at homeschooling conferences, and I've written on this topic about the importance of a good, solid Christian liberal arts education. And for one of the reasons for that is because I was the recipient of the opposite of that, a really hideous education, secular fundamentalist education. It was compulsory in England in those days to have religious education. And in my school, my only memory of religious education was a geography lesson about where Palestine was. In other words, they could not bring themselves to talk about religion at all. But they can say, well, Jerusalem's here, and Nazareth is here, and, Bethlehem is here. And that was all I remember at all about my so-called religious education. And it was really summed up by the motto of the school auditorium. All the children, all the students gathered for assembly once a day, had a big stage, all the chairs set out front, and above the stage in great big letters were the words, "This above all, to thine own self be true. William Shakespeare." Now, I was taught by my father that William Shakespeare was the greatest Englishman who ever lived. Now, I believe that the many, many English saints are greater than William Shakespeare, but I understand what my father means, and certainly in terms of the gifts given, William Shakespeare is arguably the greatest Englishman who ever lived. And I respected, even revered William Shakespeare. My father would quote swathes from Shakespeare's plays. So if Shakespeare said this, it must be true. This above all, to thine own self be true. And I treated my school with contempt, but I thought at least I can take that with me as a motto, a personal motto. And of course, that is radical relativism. There is no truth, ultimately, except your own truth. As long as you're being true to yourself, it's the only truth that really, ultimately matters. It's above all else. So I took that as my personal motto. Now, what I didn't realize, of course, is my school was ignorant. So when you're a kid, when you're a teenager, you think that your school teachers are brilliant, and your school is brilliant, and you're just an idiot that's got to learn. Now I realise why I didn't learn is because the school were idiots. Because the thing about that line, "This above all to thine own self be true," is it was not said by William Shakespeare. It was written by William Shakespeare. But it was said by Polonius in Hamlet, who is a blithering idiot. That line comes from his famous speech to his son. His son Laertes is about to go off to Paris to college. And so Polonius, who's a blithering idiot, thinks, well, I'm his father, I should probably give him some practical advice now about how to get on in the world. The important lessons he needs to know about life. The big questions. So the talk is about wearing the right clothes, picking the right arguments, knowing when to be quiet, knowing when to speak up, never a borrower or a lender be. And this above all, to thine own self be true. No mention of God. No mention of right or wrong. No mention of virtue. No mention of love. No mention of love in the sense of sacrificially giving yourself to another. None of that. Now, what Shakespeare shows us in Hamlet is the disastrous consequences of that relativism. Because by the play's end, Polonius has got himself killed. And he's presented in such a way that none of us like him and none of us really care. And Laertes, following his father's advice of just being true to himself and following his passions, becomes a dupe of the wicked King Claudius and also gets himself killed after also bringing about the death of the innocent victim Hamlet, for which he does repent at the last. So this philosophy gets Polonius killed, gets his son killed, and his daughter Ophelia is driven mad and commits suicide. So what does Shakespeare tell us about my school's motto? This above all to thine own self be true. That it's deadly, poisonous, suicidal, the anthem of the culture of death, the dangers of a bad education. So I took this education and, being true to myself, at the age of 15, joined a white supremacist organisation called the National Front. Now, the National Front's policy was, and I can remember, I think I'm quoting the manifesto word for word, even after all these years, the compulsory repatriation of all non-whites to their lands of ethnic origin. Now let's unpack that a bit. Compulsory repatriation. So no voluntary repatriation, no giving people money and asking them to leave, frog marching them out of the country against their will if necessary. And not just immigrants. Compulsory repatriation of all non-whites to their lands of ethnic origin. So you could be a second or third generation non-white immigrant, and you would be sent back to whatever country your parents or grandparents came from. Now, I think this is a pernicious policy, and it was a pernicious organisation. But from the perspective of my own education, this above all, to thine own self be true, I don't see how I can be condemned. Because if I make the rules, and no one has the right to tell me what the right rules are, because there is no right or wrong except what I want, then my right and wrong is the same as everybody else's right and wrong. From a relativist perspective, I could not be condemned. I was following the advice of that motto. I believed this was true. I did believe it was true. I wasn't thinking I was evil. I thought this was good. I was wrong. Because I don't believe that this above all to their own self be true. I believe there is right and wrong, and good and evil, and objective truth. From a Christian perspective, you can condemn those policies. From an ethical perspective, you can condemn those policies. From a relativist perspective, you have no right to condemn anybody or anything. So I joined the National Front, this white supremacist organisation. I was a racist, did not like coloured people. Also, I was very, very anti-Catholic. And in 1978, October 1978, made the first of many visits to Northern Ireland. Now, those of you that are old enough will remember the Troubles in Northern Ireland. That's what they were called, the Troubles. From the late 1960s to the late 1990s, a period of 30 years, almost 4,000 people were killed in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Now, bear in mind, this is from a population of 1.5 million. So for the equivalent in the United States, you'd have to multiply that by 20. So it would be the equivalent of nearly 80,000 people being killed. There was basically nobody in Northern Ireland who didn't know somebody who had been killed in this dispute. I went over there in 1978, I was 17. I was a militant loyalist. Now, in Northern Ireland, the two sides were the Loyalists and the Republicans. The Loyalists were the Protestant population of Northern Ireland, some Catholics as well, but basically the Protestants of Northern Ireland who wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom. They flew the Union Jack, and they were British. And then the Republicans were those who believed that the 6 counties in the north of Ireland, they wouldn't use the word Northern Ireland, they'd say north of Ireland. 6 counties in the north of Ireland should become part of a united Ireland of all 32 counties, and they flew the Irish tricolour. I was very much on the loyalist side. I was a British patriot and I hated Catholics. So that first trip in 1978, there was a huge riot, went on most of the evening. I give far more details about it in my book. Don't really have time to linger about the details of that riot. That was the second commercial, by the way, if you hadn't noticed. But I joined an organisation called the Orange Order. Now, the Orange Order is a secret society, a bit like the Freemasons, except it exists for one reason and one reason only: to hate Catholics. And, of course, technically it was a Protestant organisation, but I wasn't a Protestant. I was tribally a Protestant. But, I didn't care whether God existed. I was never an atheist, didn't care whether God existed. I had a friend of mine who's a militant atheist, who's also a member of the Orange Order. And when, during the lodge meetings, they read from Scripture, which was part of the ritual, he and I would smirk at each other, because we were the secret non-believers. The important thing was not that you were a believing Christian, but that you hated Catholics. We were allowed in because we hated Catholics. This is the important thing, by the way, in Northern Ireland, and the politics of Northern Ireland. It was tribal. It's not a religious conflict, it's a tribal conflict. And it's best summed up by a joke, which I'll now tell you. Back in 1978, shall we say, at the height of the Troubles, when people are being killed on an almost daily basis in Northern Ireland, there's an American. May as well make him an American. He's walking around Belfast. And he's in a central part of Belfast, which is safe-ish, safe as anywhere was in Belfast in those days. But he wanders around and realises he's wandered into another part of town. And he realises he's lost. He also realises it's not a very nice part of town. He starts to get a little bit worried. This is a dangerous place to be. And then his worst fears come true, because this group of rather ominous-looking young men emerge from the shadows and approach him. And they say to him, "Are you a Protestant or a Catholic?" And he thinks to himself, this is a very dangerous question, like flipping a coin. If I give the wrong answer, I could be killed. So he thinks quickly, and then he says, "I'm an atheist." And he's very smug. He thinks, how clever I am. I've avoided that difficult situation. And these young men look at each other, and they look rather confused and perplexed, and they scratch their heads, and they said, "Yes, but are you a Protestant atheist or a Catholic atheist?" Although it's funny, it's also true, because that's exactly the situation. They didn't care whether you believed. They didn't care whether you went to church. What tribe were you a member of? Well, I was a member of the Protestant tribe, and I hated Catholics. Didn't love Christ, just hated Catholics. I was also involved with the loyalist terrorist organisations in Northern Ireland. The two best known, I knew the leadership of both of these organisations, were the Ulster Defence Association, the UDA, is the Protestant equivalent of the IRA. They shot people, planted bombs, etc. And also an organisation which were even more extreme than the UDA, the Ulster Volunteer Force, the UVF. And again, I had meetings with the leadership of the UVF to discuss things that even now I probably shouldn't talk about in public. And I knew the leadership of the UDA very well. In fact, one of my friends in the leadership of the UDA was subsequently killed by the IRA. And then one day I was in a drinking club just north of Belfast in a place called Rathcoole. And one of the ways that the IRA and the UDA and the UVF, these terrorist organisations on both sides of the divide, raised money. I mean, they robbed banks. Eventually they'd also start selling drugs, but not in those days. But they would rob banks, and they would have a string of drinking clubs. So I was in a drinking club owned by the UVF, where the profits go to basically buy guns. Enjoying the anti-Catholic music, enjoying the beer. Most things have changed, some things haven't. Actually, very good. I have to find out from Justin what it is at some stage. And then, as I'm listening to the music, enjoying the beer, someone taps me on the shoulder. And they say that I'm wanted outside. Now, when you're in a drinking club owned by a terrorist organisation, that you don't want to hear that. And my life passes before my eyes, and I'm thinking, well, what have I done? Have I upset the local UVF godfather? Have I made eyes at his daughter or something? I mean, who knows? So I didn't have much choice. I went outside, and 3 men were waiting for me. That's also ominous because, what they were was an active service unit, in other words, a terrorist cell of the UVF. That's the usual preferred number, 3. More than that, and you start leaking information. Less than that, and it doesn't work, so 3. And they introduced themselves, I think of their names, but they told me who they were, and then the spokesman, they were probably a couple of years older than me. I was probably 19, and they were probably 20, 21. And they told me they thought that the leadership of the UVF were too soft and liberal. Now, this UVF are fanatic killers and murderers. So I realised I was with a group of psychopaths. And they said that they wanted instead to defect from the UVF and become the paramilitary or terrorist wing of the Young National Front, of which at that time I was the chairman. They wanted to put themselves under my command, and they would kill anybody I wanted them to kill. Just had to give them the information. Now, thankfully, as much of a bad person I was never psychopathic enough to want to order the deaths of other people, even my enemies. But what do you say? They said to me, we can show you our arsenal of weapons to show that we mean what we mean business. I said, no, I believe you, because I did. So I sort of equivocated. And I said, yeah, that's great. But I didn't want to say, are you crazy? Because, you don't say you're crazy to crazy people. Bad mistake. So that's a great idea. I think we should discuss this further. This is probably not the right time to do it. Tell you what, I'll be in touch. When I got back to England, of course, I was not in touch with them. And within a year, the leader of that terrorist cell, the one who was doing most of the talking, was sentenced to life in prison for shooting dead the mother of an IRA man on her doorstep. Now, to be fair to him, I don't think he was planning to kill the mother. I think he was planning to kill the son. But, the IRA man was probably living in the middle of an IRA ghetto, where IRA men are always, keeping an eye on things with guns. He's probably scared. And he was basically trigger happy and scared, and whoever answered the door was going to get it. And that's what happened. And he was sentenced to life imprisonment. I was also involved, as if my white supremacist neo-Nazi aspect and then this anti-Catholic loyalist terrorist aspect were not enough. I was also involved with the neo-fascist terrorists in Europe. Back in the late 1970s, a bomb went off in Bologna railway station in the north of Italy, killing over 150 people. And the organisations that were blamed for that were a group called Terza Posizione, International Third Position. And they escaped. The leaders of that organisation escaped from the country, smuggled themselves across Europe, got themselves into England, and we supplied them with safe houses, places to lie low for a while. I became a good friend of the leader of that organisation. His name's Roberto Fiore. If you actually Google Roberto Fiore, you'll see he's a convert to Catholicism and is now a campaigner for pro-life issues in Italy and is a member of the European Parliament. I still think he has some rather strange ideas, however. Apart from those good ones. They're not strange, they're good ones, but nonetheless, he certainly moved somewhat in the right direction. And I don't believe he was responsible for the Bologna bombing, or that organisation was responsible for the Bologna bombing. I believe that they were framed. But I don't know. And the reason I don't know is that when you are dealing with terrorists, whether it's Northern Ireland or Italy, the one thing you always have, the rule you have to live by, is the need to know principle. If you don't need to know, don't ask. Because it protects you, for starters. You know, if you don't know anything, how can you be in any trouble? Once you do know something, you're in trouble. But also it protects the terrorists. The fewer people know, the safer they are. So no one ever asked. So I don't know. I was also very heavily involved in the skinhead music scene. The skinheads were on the rise about 1980. And I founded a record label called White Noise Records. Great name, because that's exactly what it produced, White Noise. And the first single we released on that record label was by a band called Screwdriver. Screwdriver spelt with a K, as in skinhead. And the single was called White Power. And I guest vocaled on that single. And my part my part in the chorus was White Power. There we are. That was good. I mean, I really have lost my. I really did not fulfill my vocation as a rock singer, and in fact I can remember the words after all these years. It's astonishing. And on the B side, there was a track called Smash the IRA. And I also guest vocaled on that, and my part in that was Smash, Smash. There we are. Remember it all to this day. The other track on that single, by the way, was called Shove the Dove. I did not guest vocal on it. I'm not going to tell you what the lyrics are about. I'll leave it to your furtive imagination. In fact, we should probably move on. And in case you're beginning to think, well, he must have had some endearing qualities. I was also very anti-American. Organised demonstrations outside US air bases with Yanks Go Home placards. Our members, this is National Front members, would be fighting with members of the US Air Force in the local pubs around the US air bases. So no, I didn't have many redeeming qualities at all. I edited a magazine called Bulldog, the newspaper of the Young National Front. And for editing this newspaper, I was sentenced to 6 months in prison for publishing material likely to incite racial hatred. And I consider myself to be a political prisoner. I spent my 21st birthday in prison. And I consider myself to be a political prisoner and a political soldier, and I used my bunk bed in my cell as a bench press, and I got myself in shape, and I came out and I carried on. And I carried on all editing Bulldog, but I didn't want to go straight back to prison, and nor did I want to tone it down. So the editor of Bulldog became Captain Truth, this sort of superhero with a mask and a big T across his very big chest. Now, the British police force are not necessarily noted for their being the most intelligent people in the world, perhaps, but they're not that stupid. I think they began to suspect after a couple of years that Captain Truth didn't really exist. And one day, in the middle of the night, my house was raided by the police. They found all the evidence they needed to prove that I was indeed still the editor. I was Captain Truth. And I was charged and sentenced once again for publishing material likely to incite racial hatred. And was sentenced this time to 12 months in prison. And I spent my 25th birthday in prison. But there was a big difference. Because during the second prison sentence, someone's just sent me a message, go away. I don't know what the time is. If you don't, thank you. Second prison sentence, I didn't even know why I was there, I mean, I knew the offence I committed, and it was indeed fair to say that I was publishing material likely to incite racial hatred. But I didn't know if I even believed it anymore. So the second prison sentence was much, much harder. Because why am I here? Now, when you're processed, when you go to prison, how many people here have been... No, I won't. I went off. But I imagine it's the same over here. When you go to prison, you're processed. There's a sort of questions you ask. Do you suffer from these diseases? Are you addicted to these things? And one of the questions they ask is, what's your religion? So I'm not expecting it. And the question is, what's your religion? And I say, Catholic. And then I thought, what have I said? I'm not a Catholic. Why did I say that? But the question took me by surprise, and I gave the answer. That meant I had a red card outside my room, my cell, for the remainder of the sentence. The Catholics were red. That was the colour coding. So that means and I started to go to mass during that second prison sentence. But why the change? The second day of that sentence, I remember holding some rosary beads. And I knew what rosary beads were because in Northern Ireland we sang a song, an anti-Catholic song, rather perversely and ironically sang to the tune of Home on the Range, believe it or not. And it went like this. No Pope of Rome, no chapels to sadden my eyes, no nuns and no priests, no rosary beads. Every day is the 12th of July. So I knew what rosary beads were, things that those papists prayed with. My father, when I was young, my mother's mother was from County Galway, and when she died, she had 9 children, and they were all brought up as nominal Anglicans, de facto agnostics. But when my grandmother died, my mother took her rosary beads, just as a memento. My mother would have no idea how to say the rosary, nor any desire to do so. It was just a keepsake, to remind her of her mother. And my father came home from the pub one night and got hold of the beads and said, "We're not having those papist beads in the house," and threw them out of the window. And he called, his name for Catholics was bead rattlers. That was his term of abuse. Bead rattlers, those who rattle their beads. So I knew what rosary beads were, but I didn't want to throw my rosary beads out of the window. I could, because the window opened. You couldn't climb out of it because there were bars on it, but you could throw something out of it. I could have thrown the rosary beads away. I had no desire to do so. And what I wanted to do was pray. But there was a problem. I'd never prayed in my life. I'm 24 years old, 2 months short of my 25th birthday. I never prayed in my life. But I want to pray the rosary. Now, there's a problem because I don't know the Creed, don't know the Apostles' Creed, I don't know the Hail Mary, I don't know the Glory Be, and I had been taught the Our Father when I was about that high and had long since forgotten it. So how does one pray the rosary? Well, what I did was to fumble the beads and mumble inarticulate prayers. And answers started to flood in. What I now realise also was happening was healing began to flood in. And I started to go to Mass during that second prison sentence. I began to develop a faltering prayer life. Now, but why? Still haven't answered the question why. How did that happen? In the 4 years between the two sentences. Well, I wasn't interested in religion at all. You would never have got me to read a religious book, Christian book, certainly not a Catholic book. But I was interested in politics, obviously. And we would have demonstrations on the streets, and the extreme left, the communists, would attack us, and there'd be fights, brawls, and also verbal abuse. And one of the things they would accuse us of being, our side, of being, you are just the stormtroopers of capitalism. Now, my attitude was, I may despise communism, but I refuse to believe they're the only alternative to the things that are wrong in the world. And it doesn't mean, because I'm opposed to communism, that I want the world run and ruled by Bill Gates. Well, Bill Gates wasn't around then, but whoever the equivalent was. I didn't want the world carved up into a globalist plutocracy where the richest multinational corporations and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund all got together to carve everything up for their own benefit. But I refused to accept communism was the alternative to that. So I was interested, and someone said, well, have you read the economic ideas of G.K. Chesterton? And of course I hadn't, and who on earth is G.K. Chesterton? But I was interested, and they said, well, you need to read one essay in particular by Chesterton, and it's in a book called The Well and the Shallows. So I go out and buy this book. The essay's 2/3 of the way through the book. The rest of the book is a defense of the Catholic Church. The book's called The Well and the Shallows. The well is the Catholic Church. Deep, life-giving. The shallows is everything else, particularly the attacks upon the church. I read Chesterton, and of course I didn't believe and didn't agree with his Catholicism, but I couldn't help liking him. I couldn't help liking his personality, which seemed to leap from the page. I certainly agreed with his economics. I agreed with his politics. There was enough that I agreed with to make me want to carry on reading. And I continued to read Chesterton. I couldn't get enough Chesterton. And then one day I was walking through a second-hand bookshop in the East End of London. And I was looking, one of my favourite pastimes, buying second-hand books. And I saw this book by someone called C.S. Lewis. I had sort of heard of Lewis, but I had no real idea who he was. Possibly I'd heard a line in which I've never read it, but I might have heard of it. Something, I think, again, grace, prompted me to pluck the book from the shelf. It was Surprised by Joy, Lewis's conversion story. And there's no index in that book, so I couldn't have. So I used to tell this story and say, I looked in the index and saw the word Chesterton. But I didn't, because there is no index. Someone pointed it out to me. Well, there's memory playing tricks with you. So what I must have done was just open the book at random. It's even more miraculous. I opened the book at random, and the magic word Chesterton leapt out at me. Oh, Chesterton, in a book by this chap called Lewis. And actually what it was Lewis recounting his first experience of reading Chesterton during the First World War, during World War I in the trenches in France. He read a book of Chesterton's essays. And Lewis was an atheist when he read Chesterton. And he said that there was something about Chesterton that he couldn't help liking, in spite of his Christianity. And I thought, yes, that's it. Me exactly. Something about Chesterton I can't help liking in spite of his Catholicism. And then he said that he came to see Chesterton as having more common sense than all the moderns put together, except, of course, his Christianity. But yes, exactly. So I bought Surprised by Joy by C.S. Lewis. Read that, loved it. Started buying loads of books by C.S. Lewis. And then Hilaire Belloc. Eventually John Henry Newman. And sometimes I'm speaking at Catholic homeschooling conferences and someone asks me the question, when did you first read The Lord of the Rings? I said, during my second prison sentence, actually. Because it's that thick, and you're busy, And then you've got a 12-month prison sentence. I'm in solitary confinement. Perfect! So these people together, and I said Newman, and then I think during the second prison sentence I started reading Thomas Aquinas. But it's all over by then. So when I got out of prison, I knew I had to break from my past. Bearing in mind, I joined this organisation when I was 15 years old. I was now 26, 25. And I had to break from everybody I knew. I knew nobody, except my mum and dad, that wasn't in the organisation. So I had to physically leave London and move to a place in the backwoods of England to start afresh. And when I was received into the Catholic Church, actually 25 years ago yesterday, St. Joseph's Day 1989, the priest arranged for the ladies of the parish to bake me a cake, and it had "Welcome Home, Joe" on the top of it. And they asked me to make a speech. Now, you'd have gathered that I'm not short of words. In fact, you're probably wondering when am I going to stop. It's that long. Right? And I'm like a car. When that runs out, I stop. But I thought, I'm standing up there, and I have nothing to say. For the first and only time in my life, I'm completely tongue-tied. How does one adequately put into words the enormity and magnificence of being received into Christ's mystical body? One can't. So all that I said then is, I've come home. And when you ask me again now, you'll tongue-tie me again, ultimately, because that's what it's about. I've come home. And I had a postscript to finish with, to show God's sense of humour in this. When I started my new life, I wanted to try to get a book published. My name, by the way, was infamous. The 2 prison sentences, the court cases made national headlines. There were Free Joe Pearce campaigns throughout England so that you couldn't travel more than 10 miles on any freeway in England without Free Joe Pearce being seen. So I knew I couldn't write anything in my name because nobody would publish it. So I decided to go under the pseudonym, the nom de plume of Robert Williamson. Now, why would I choose the name Robert Williamson? Well, because there's a song that the Orange Order sing about an orange man who becomes a Catholic. And I'm going to sing it to you, at least the first part, because it's relevant to the very end of the talk. In the county Tyrone, near the town of Dungannon, where many's a ruction, myself had a Hannon, Bob Williamson lived there, a weaver by trade, and all of us thought him a stout orange blade. But the cunning young coo-boy sure took us all in, and he married a papish called Bridget McGinn, turned papish himself, and forsook the old cause that gave us our freedom, religion, and laws. Now the boys of the town, they made some noise upon it, and Bob had to fly to the province of Connaught, and so it goes on. So this orange man called Robert Williamson, Bob Williamson, who marries a papish, a Catholic, and the orange man not very happy about it. I thought, that's me. I am Bob Williamson. So that's why I chose that name. Well, my first book published was a biography of G.K. Chesterton, and that was an act of thanksgiving. An act of thanksgiving to God for giving me Chesterton. But also, under grace, an act of thanksgiving to Chesterton for giving me God. Now, God's sense of humour. If you had said to me in my fanatical days that I would marry an American, or live in America, or become a US citizen, I would have laughed you to scorn. No way would I ever marry a Yank. Well, I did. Married an American girl, beautiful American girl called Susanna. But that's sort of so-so. But her mother is from the County Tyrone near the town of Dungannon. She was born in a little village called The Rock, about 10 miles outside Dungannon in County Tyrone. So I am Robert Williamson. I am Bob Williamson. I didn't marry Bridget McGinn, but I did marry Bridget McGinn's daughter. And then Leo, our son. When we got married in 2001, we moved to England. Well, I was living there, my wife moved to England. And then after 4 months of marriage, we moved to the States. I came over to the States, we've been living here ever since. But by then we were expecting our first child. So I said to Susanna, look, we're Catholics, aren't we? She said, yes. I can run a little bit on empty. She says, yes. I said, well, that means we believe that life begins at conception, don't we? She said, yes. I said, well, that means our son's English, doesn't it? She said, no. So I said, well, I think we should call him George. And she said, no. I said, why not? I said, St. George. What's wrong? It's a good Catholic name, St. George. He said, over here it said it's not St. George, it's King George. And I was thinking, George Washington? I mean, where's the problem here, But anyway, we compromised, and he was going to be called Leo. That's the compromise. That's a good marriage. He was going to be called Leo George. That's fine. I was happy with that. But then our son disobeyed his father before even leaving the womb. That's a bad start. Because he was born on St. Patrick's Day. So our son, exactly, you can't make it up. It's God. I don't think God's an Irishman, though. I'm not going that far, okay? But, so his name, of course, is Leo Patrick. And what else could it be? So I'm happy to genuflect before the Irish when it's quite clearly God's joke. Now, I just want to say one other thing, because sometimes I forget this. My father, who I had a very deep relationship with, again, third commercial break, lots of it in the book, was received into the Catholic Church 10 years before he died. And for me, that's a bigger miracle than my own conversion. And again, the loving grace of God. I happened to be in England when he was rushed to hospital. He died a few days later, speaking at a C.S. Lewis conference in Cambridge. And Cambridge is only 60 miles from where my parents live, so it's a 1.5 hour drive. So I could be there. And also, there were about 400 committed Christians praying for my father in the final days of his life. And the last time I saw him, which is about 2 or 3 hours before he died, he and I prayed the rosary together. He'd already received the last rites of the church. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Thank you.